Do you think that Israel is affecting American political judgment?
I mean,
you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air, you know what's in the air. It's possibility, it's possibility, it's possibility, it's possibility.
All right, so Joe Rogan did a podcast with JD Vance. This is the second time that JD Vance has been on there, as far as I can tell. This is kind of him trying to smooth over with the base, with Joe Rogan himself, some of these questions that people have about Israel, about Epstein files, about the Iran war, etc. So he's kind of on defense for a lot of this conversation, and it's becoming pretty clear that a lot of these guys who caped for Trump and then were kind of like, I don't know how I feel about Trump anymore. To be clear, that's not so much Joe Rogan. Rogan is pretty consistently on the Trump train. But others like Tim Dillon, Theo Vaughn, all of them would be willing to vote for JD Vance and probably will go back to caping for JD Vance when the time comes around. So I want to try to identify what some of the emerging narratives are that some of these people are going to be paving out for us over the next couple years, as well as pointing out just how willing Joe Rogan is to let JD Vance just lie straight to his face, knowingly lie to his face, and it's just because he hates Democrats. He has become so radicalized against Democrats and so partisan captured, Joe Rogan has, that he is willing to just listen to this guy who is obviously clearly lying. So this first part is just an interesting example of that, where they're talking about voter fraud and Democrats stealing elections. So this will show you how radicalized Joe Rogan is on this issue. And the only reason I'm showing this is because it circles back around at the end. They're talking about the idea of voter ID.
I'm not skeptical. I'm accusing them. I think they stole the election.
yes.
And
yes.
I think it's common. And this idea that elections can't be stolen. I always say to people, okay, do you think that the amount of election fraud is 0%? No one thinks that.
Yeah.
No one thinks it's zero.
Exactly.
There's always some overzealous person that works somewhere that's doing something. There's always crazy people that like blue no matter who, we gotta win, or red no matter what. There's always people, right and left, that are going to try to rig the election because they think it's imperative. Look, we saw. There was people like Oprah Winfrey was saying it. Like, if we don't win this election, you may never vote again. Like,
Yep.
What the fuck are you talking about? Like, why? Who's going to tolerate that?
That's
Left
right.
or right? That's crazy.
That's right.
But that attitude allows people to justify cheating.
Correct.
And I think they cheat. And I think they've been doing it forever.
Absolutely.
And I don't think there's any other reason why you would have no voter ID. And they try to say, oh, it's racist to have voter ID. Like, what are you talking about? Do you think other races are incapable of going to the DMV? That's insane.
Yeah, it's
racist.
It's actually super racist.
That's really racist.
Right, the implication of their argument is literally like blacks and Hispanics cannot go to the DMV to get an ID. I'll offer on the Joe Rogan podcast this deal as vice president of these United States that if Democrats really don't think that there's any cheating, give us voter ID.
All right, so here's my counter offer to JD Vance. And I've wanted to mention this a couple times on this podcast because this issue of voter ID has come up a few times, and it's one of these things where Republicans like to say, it's common sense. Why wouldn't you have to present your ID when you go to vote? And they say it's racist to say that people can't present their ID when they're going to vote. So this is very simple. If you instituted universal voter ID tomorrow, it would mean that less people are able to vote. People who are citizens, people who are registered to vote, which does verify whether or not you're a citizen, would not be able to vote because they don't have IDs, they don't have easy access to getting a new ID in time to vote, et cetera, et cetera. So if what you want is for every eligible citizen to be able to vote and to be able to prove that they're a citizen with their ID when they go to vote, you should support a government program to put a new ID in everyone's hand. Anything short of that, you are literally just trying to decrease the amount of eligible voters. If there is no effort by the government to make sure that people can get those IDs. You're just trying to kick people off the voter rolls. That's what Republicans want to do. They always want to do that. They will find any argument they can think of to try to justify that. Joe Rogan is obviously radicalized and stupid enough to go for it, to the point where he's literally saying, I'm accusing Democrats in Los Angeles of stealing the election because 2 Democrats won over a Republican in Los Angeles, one of the most predictable votes of all time, because it is so unthinkable to them that the mail-in ballots would lean towards Nithya Raman. This is something that is emerging as a favorite of Republicans, to just point to fraud without any type of evidence and say, well, we can't prove anything because you guys won't let us prove anything, blah, blah, blah. It's an endless conversation. The point is that leaning Republican means you're leaning against enfranchisement of as many people as possible. That includes black people, that includes immigrants, etc. That's the history of this country. Republicans are against that enfranchisement. So that's all this comes down to, and JD Vance is just sort of putting a new face on that, and that's why Joe Rogan has gone from being some kind of reasonable centrist with sort of an interesting twist to being literally just a racist Republican. That's all he is at this point. That being said, this next part is one of the only places throughout this conversation where Joe really consistently challenges what JD Vance is saying and actually pushes back against him, and it's on this issue of religion in schools. This is something that apparently Joe Rogan does have some concern about. He talked to James Tallarico on his podcast about this. JD Vance immediately is trying to justify it, and Joe Rogan, to his credit, does push a little bit on that specific issue, although he lets JD Vance get away with a lot while doing it. So here's that.
You know, one of the things, I had James Tallarico on the podcast, and one of the things that I think he has a really good point about, even though I know you're Catholic and you're very religious, putting the 10 Commandments in schools, I don't think is the right way to do it. And this is a guy, Tallarico, who was in seminary and is very Christian. Mm-hmm. He just thinks that even though he believes in the 10 Commandments, if you're just only representing the Christian faith in these schools, you're forcing your religion into other people's lives, and that this is going to push people away from Christianity rather than encourage them to pursue it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you never want to force things on people, and I do. I think one of the core Christian contributions to Western civilization is the idea of freedom of religion. It's actually very much a Christian idea. I don't think putting the 10 Commandments up in school is like forcing things on anybody.
But it's public schools. So, I mean, if you're going to do that, why not put Buddhist scripture? Why not put, Muslim stuff? You could make an argument why you should have a bunch of different religious tenets.
Here's my view on it. Like, I would not be offended if I sat in a classroom as a Christian, or if my kids sat in a classroom as a Christian and saw, a religious text that wasn't Christian on the wall. I would encourage them to see that. No, I'd encourage them to see that as a learning experience. To try to understand
what if it was
things.
from the Quran? What a bunch of
I guess it depends on what it was, right? If it's like something crazy, I would kind of put it on Tallarico in a slightly different way. That for a long time in this country, there were actually Supreme Court rulings that said that you cannot pray in a school, even a student organization led by the students, or that you cannot put the 10 Commandments up, even a teacher who chose to do it in their own classroom. Was he equally offended when the 10 Commandments were like quite literally prohibited from being listed in a public building?
I don't know if he was offended by that or if he was opposed to that.
Okay, so it's hilarious that JD Vance keeps saying Tallarico. So that's what I mean by JD Vance just lying directly to Joe Rogan's face. He's trying to pretend that he doesn't support forcing religion on people, and yet he wants the 10 Commandments to be up in public schools. He says, I wouldn't mind if they had other religions up there as well. That's a crock of shit. That's a lie. And the fact that he's saying Tallarico, this is classic politician stuff. It's the same as when they call Mamdani Mandami and stuff like that. If you just mispronounce the guy's name a little bit, it just kind of hurts the brand clarity. So ridiculous that he's doing that right to Joe's face, right after Joe just said the guy's name out loud. And Joe doesn't call him out about it, even though you can kind of sense a little bit that he probably had the temptation to. So I want to get into a little bit more of the meat of this episode. This is where they talk about the Iran war and whether or not Israel had an influence on that, on the fact that we are in the Iran war, and then it kind of transitions into talking about Epstein, whether that had any influence on the war, as well as whether or not JD Vance thinks they handled that right. So here is probably the part that's going to get talked about the most.
You know, foreign governments try to influence the United States all the time. You know, Israel does it, other countries do it. It's just sort of the nature of the beast. What bothers me is actually when Americans allow, meaning American leadership, allows that influence to affect their judgment and to affect what they are advocating for. That's what really bothers me.
Well, the narrative is that Israel has a very disproportionate effect on American politics.
Yeah, I see that. I see that narrative. I mean, I actually think that they look, do they try to influence American politics? Yes. But like I said earlier, a lot of other countries do. I think
to the extent that Israel does,
I think some are better at it than others. I think the Israelis are definitely more effective at it than most, but I wouldn't say that they're the only effective country by any means that tries to influence American politics. But I know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there have been people within the Israeli government who are trying to actually shift us away from that policy because they want to continue the military campaign. But I guess what I would say to the Americans who sort of see this and are frustrated by it, my attitude would be you should be frustrated at American leaders who are, persuaded by this, affected by this.
Do you think that Israel is affecting American political judgment?
I mean, I certainly think that there are a lot of talking points and there are a lot of arguments that make their way into American political discourse. I think there are a lot of social media campaigns that definitely influence Americans and affect Americans. Do I think that it's been dispositive on any particular issue? I think that's a much more difficult question.
Do you think that we would have started this war in Iran without the influence of Israel?
I think the president, completely separate from any influence from Israel, believes very strongly, and again, I agree with this, that Iran should not have a nuclear weapon.
Right,
and I
but
think he was willing to do things.
Bombed them in June. Right, that was the initial attack, right?
June of last year.
Yeah.
Midnight Hammer, yeah.
Right. Do you think he would have continued with the most recent campaign if it wasn't for the influence of Israel?
Yes, I do.
Really?
I do, yeah.
Can you understand, though, why people would come to that conclusion, especially because of the Epstein files?
What do you mean?
Well, the Epstein files were supposed to be released, and there was a tremendous amount of resistance to those files being released, and that concerned a lot of people. Because if you're talking about very wealthy, powerful people that were engaged in crimes,
I see. So you're basically saying the fear is that whatever's in the Epstein files was used to blackmail the administration into doing the Iran thing.
Or at the very least, the people that were involved in the Epstein files that didn't want them coming out had undue influence.
Well, again, say this with all candor, we absolutely screwed up the comms of the Epstein files, we just did. But do I think the reason we screwed up the comms is because we were trying to hide something? No. I think the reason we screwed up the comms of the Epstein files is one, Pam Bondi said the client list is on my desk, right?
Well, they had binders. They were standing in front.
But those binders were largely documents that had already been released, right? So let me try to.
Well, what was the purpose of that performative display of the Epstein files? And she was saying there's tens of thousands of hours of film.
I don't know what the purpose of it was, but I know that the effect of it was to make people mistrust the entire effort.
Well, most people think he was Mossad.
Yeah, Mossad or CIA or some other deep state, whether in America or Israel or another country. Or both. Look, he clearly had connections to the highest levels of American intelligence. He clearly had connections to the highest levels of Israeli intelligence. In fact, one of the interesting things the Epstein saga reveals about, and I try to make this point, is one of the reasons why I'm always careful, and I say there are some elements within the Israeli government who don't like our peace process, because there are a lot of elements within the Israeli government that actually do like our peace process. They recognize that this indefinite campaign is not good for them either. And the Epstein thing is interesting because as much as I know, Prime Minister Netanyahu, not a particularly popular person in the United States of America right now, Epstein seemed to be connected to the elements of the Israeli deep state that were left of center.
Yeah, so he's doing something really interesting at the end there, where he's trying to pretend that the forces within the Israeli government that are trying to work against the peace deal is the left of center aspect. He's kind of saying that the aspects of the Israeli government that Jeffrey Epstein had ties to, supposedly the crazy lefties in the Israeli government, those are the ones trying to tank negotiations, as though the ones that want endless war are not the current right-wing government that is currently in power. And that's to the extent that there is any left of center leadership in Israel anywhere. He's referring to Ehud Barak, who was one of the main people corresponding with Epstein, who was a little bit more of like the liberal side. But at the same time, all of them support genocide. This is a genocidal apartheid project. To the extent that there's any left-wing element of the government at all, it's literally just a slightly more liberalized version of apartheid and genocide. So it's a weird argument he's making. He's trying to insulate the current power structures of Israel from being connected with Epstein, which we know is a bunch of horseshit. And he's also downplaying the influence of Israel in general and downplaying Donald Trump's participation in the Epstein files, his name being in the Epstein files, saying that the reason they didn't want to put that stuff out there, the reason they were so obfuscating about it, is not because they had anything to hide. That's ridiculous. It's just because they wanted to be so forthright, they wanted to be so transparent that they were just having trouble knowing how to do it. And this is the position that JD Vance is in right now, because he knows he wants to run for president. He also knows that he's going to get smacked with all of this stuff over and over again, but he also can't criticize the president on this stuff. He can't distance himself from it quite yet, but he's trying to lay the groundwork. He's trying to emphasize the fact that, well, I told Trump we shouldn't go to war, but now that we're going to war, I support him 100%. That's essentially what he says. And that's why he has to tie the efforts to sabotage this peace deal to like supposed left-wing elements in the Israeli government so that he can try to work with that narrative going forward. That's not going to work. This war is nowhere near over. And when he says, there are people who want to tank the negotiations, they've won. There is no negotiation. We are still at war with Iran. We're going to be for the foreseeable future. There's really no signs that we're going to get a deal anytime soon. And that would imply that whoever is going to come to power next, be a prominent nominee next in the Republican Party, is not going to be JD Vance, because he was a part of this whole mess, and all of these statements that he's made in some form supporting this war publicly, even though there's whispers and media kind of doing his work for him behind the scenes saying that he's against this war, he's still publicly supporting it, and that's going to come up to hurt him over and over again. But the Joe Rogans, the Tim Dillons, and Theo Vaughns, they're going to line up behind JD Vance if he gets the nomination. And I think that what we're seeing in this conversation a little bit is him starting to create the narratives for him to do that, the way that he is going to try to distinguish himself from the rest of Republicans going forward. And so that's the last clip I want to show you before I wrap this up, because it shows that JD Vance is smart enough that he is terrified of the Democratic Socialists of America. And they frame it in this conversation, and Joe frames it as like socialism. They're afraid of socialism in America. But that's not really what it's about. They're afraid of democratic socialists, and JD Vance particularly hits the democratic socialists a lot in this conversation. As soon as Joe Rogan brings it up, he takes the opportunity to come back to that over and over again, because he knows that that is the number one threat to the type of message that he has. And so that's why in this next part, you can see how he is trying to compromise a little bit on Republican positions in a way that could potentially beat a Democratic Socialist candidate, and he's really bad at it. So here's that.
When I okay, let me play devil's advocate with the DSA, because I think that their ideas are crazy, and I think that you're right. They will lead to a very totalitarian place. I'm not defending a single thing that they say, particularly their hatred of ice cream. What I am saying is, and maybe this is just sort of the way my mind works, I tend to be a little bit more empathetic. Why are young people attracted to socialism in 21st century America? One of the best interviews that Charlie Kirk ever gave, it was right before he died. It was an episode that he did with Tucker Carlson, where he talked about the fact that if you don't give young people a stake, if you don't give them ownership, if you don't give them a sense of the American dream and of possibility in the future, they're going to become socialists. This idea that nobody should own anything, we should all become renters. Whereas what we're trying to do is lower interest rates. You actually have seen housing costs stabilize in the country over the last year and a half, frankly, because of immigration. We had way too many people going after way too many homes. You close the border. This is one of the reasons why rents and housing costs have stabilized a little bit. Democrats will say private unions are at super low participation rates because the government has, been anti-union. There's like some element of truth to that. But the reality is that a lot of workers don't see the utility in joining a union because it's like, in a lot of ways, it's a 20th century institution when you need a 21st century institution. So I think updating the modern union to make more sense in the 21st century, I think that's a part of the story. I think antitrust.
Yeah, so fascinating to hear him say this thing about antitrust. Where did Lena Khan go? Lena Khan was like the icon of antitrust in the Biden administration. It's one of the only things that Biden's administration was doing well towards the end was antitrust. And a lot of people were saying that they wanted to keep Lena Khan on. That would have been a good signal to the working class base that JD Vance claims to care so much about, that we're actually going to go after corporate power, would be to keep those antitrust structures in place. Why didn't they do that? Because they're Republicans. They're never going to do that. And that's really what I want to emphasize about all of this stuff. Unions. He even mentions unions. He says we have to modernize unions. What the hell does that mean? That means you hand over the leverage to the corporations that already have all the leverage. You disempower unions even more. He tries to brush over the idea that government crushing unions or allowing corporations to crush unions is part of the reason for the low participation rate. The reason is because capital runs everything in America. And that's how you get a candidate like JD Vance. He is a capital-friendly candidate who is viewed as being able to communicate well with the working class base of America. There is an appetite among a lot of the working class base of America for right-wing politics, specifically anti-immigrant politics. So that's what gives JD Vance a little bit of room to thrive. And he says this thing about how because we're going after immigrants, that's bringing housing prices down and stabilizing rent prices. That's a bunch of horseshit. Donald Trump doesn't even support that. Donald Trump says he wants the housing prices to go up. There's a bill currently that might even be passed by Republicans to prevent private corporations from buying up homes, family homes in America, which is raising the prices. Donald Trump said he's not going to sign that. Why is that? It's because he's a Republican. This is what Republicans do, and it's what JD Vance is going to do as well. And their immigration policy is terrible. It has not solved anything. It hasn't even solved the immigration problem that they said they want to solve. All it has done is led to people getting shot in the street, killed. Everyone hates ICE now, which is a great thing. It is true that Republicans have a better structural argument on the issue of immigration right now than the left does, than Democrats do. And, he's pointing to DSA and saying they want to let all the immigrants in, therefore open borders, so they don't really support the working class base. So that's a message that he's going to continue with through whatever campaign he runs in the future. And it's very important to be able to hit back at that with something structural. So it's not just enough to say that we can't have cruel immigration policy or even do away with, abolish, and prosecute ICE, which I think we need to do. But there needs to be a structural argument for how immigrants that have been cycling through the American economy since before it was even America, how you can incorporate those people into the labor base that can meaningfully fight against corporate power and against capitalist power. That's going to be the message that DSA needs to take on immigration. There needs to be a robust vision for how you incorporate immigrants and immigrant labor into a picture of driving wages up for everybody. Because as long as there's a lack of ability to address that issue, snakes like JD Vance are going to be able to move in and say they have a better answer on it. And the Joe Rogans of the world are going to be happy to facilitate that.
I'm in the pocket, and they know they can't slow it, can't stop shit. How the game so cold, so toxic. Can't drop cause they're in somebody's